Okay, this will be a video about Elvis faking his death in 1977, which is a really bizarre story. There's a lot of weird stuff that was going on here. Obviously, the whole Elvis is alive thing is kind of regarded by a lot of people as just sort of a big joke. It's always on the cover of like supermarket tabloids, and there's all these, funny stories about places Elvis has been spotted over the years. But if you really look into it, there is some insanely strange stuff going on with his death in 1977. Something was going on here, I think. And so we'll just kind of get into it. He died in August of 1977 officially, and from the get go, from the very start, there was a whole bunch of weird stuff that happened. Um, so we'll just kind of list off a few of the really strange things and talk about them. The first thing is the death certificates. So there were actually two death certificates for Elvis Presley. There was the one on the left, and then there was one on the right. The one on the left lists his weight as 170 pounds. The one on the right does not have a weight listed at all. It was left blank. And obviously, Elvis's weight at the time of his death has always been kind of like a big controversy and a big talking point because apparently he, really ballooned up to at least 250. Some reports even say close to 300 pounds. And later in his life, he was, pretty big, and he was definitely much bigger than 170 pounds. So the fact that one of the death certificate lists his weight as 170 pounds, I mean, that's just flat out inaccurate, and the other one has the weight just blank is a little strange. Now, another strange thing is that they both have the date of October 20th, 1977, and that's over 2 months after he died. He died on August 16th, and they both have the date of October 20th. And typically, a death certificate is issued right after a death, almost immediately, because it's needed for insurance claims and things like that. So the fact that the death is, or the date on the death certificate is over 2 months after he died is another very weird thing. Another strange thing with this death certificate is that some people claim that Elvis Presley himself was the one who filled this out. So this lady's named Gail Brewer Giorgio, and she wrote a book about Elvis still being alive. And she claimed that Gene Smith, who was Elvis's first cousin and kind of regarded as his closest lifelong friend, she claimed Gene Smith contacted her after she'd published her book and told her to match up the Elvis's handwriting with the handwriting on the death certificate because he claimed he saw Elvis fill out the death certificate himself, and he told her that the handwriting on letters written by Elvis and the handwriting on the death certificate would match up. And so she contacted a like professional analyst who looked at it and confirmed what this Gene Smith said. And she actually gave a little short interview about this, and I'll go ahead and play that real quick right now.
I was told that if I checked this letter against Elvis's death certificate, which obviously had to be filled out, quote, after he died, I would find out that Elvis Presley filled out and signed his own death certificate. And I can tell you that I was told by a member of the family to have it checked out.
Gail took the death certificate and items written by Elvis to Paul Wiest, a certified graphologist who specializes in investigating forgeries.
I was asked by Gail Giorgio to examine some handwriting. The result of my examination was that I found that the slant matched on both documents, that the size of the letters was the same, the spacing between the letters was the same, and many of the individual letter forms were the same. My conclusions after this exhaustive examination was, in my professional opinion as a document examiner, that the same person who wrote the letter to President Nixon also wrote the Elvis Presley death certificate or medical examiner's report of Elvis Presley's death.
So there was a lot of weird things going on with the death certificate between the weight being completely off and the date being 2 months later, and the fact that there's two of them, and the fact that according to that expert, the signature or the handwriting of Elvis and the handwriting on the death certificate both match up. Another really strange thing that was going on almost right after his death was his funeral. And there was a whole bunch of weird stuff going on with this funeral. The first kind of suspicious thing is just the fact that it happened so quickly. He was pronounced dead pretty late in the day on August 16th, and the funeral happened on August 18th. So it was barely 24 hours after he died that they had this funeral, and this funeral was absolutely massive. It was very elaborate. So the fact that all of these things going on with the funeral were planned out and, taken care of and everything has led a lot of people to wonder, like, was this funeral, planned days or weeks or months even in advance? Because there was a whole bunch of stuff that went on with the funeral, and the fact that it happened barely 24. I mean, obviously, Elvis dying at age 42 was totally unexpected. Nobody anticipated that at all. And so the fact that this funeral just happened almost immediately, and there were all these big elaborate things going on with the funeral is pretty suspicious. So again, it was barely 24 hours. This whole funeral thing just sounds like it was totally chaotic, just almost like a carnival. There were so many people who flew in and drove in to Graceland to be there after Elvis died. And all the things that went on, we'll just kind of list off a few. The autopsy and the embalming were both completed. This is one of the more famous scenes from the funeral. There was a white Cadillac hearse with Elvis's quote unquote body inside, followed by 16 other white Cadillacs. And it was this big grand procession that drove throughout Memphis, and people lined the streets to see it. All of these limousines and Cadillacs had to be ordered and rounded up. And again, it was barely 24 hours after he had died that this took place. He had his casket. We'll talk about his casket in a bit, actually, because that's another very strange thing. But there was a specially designed casket that he had. It weighed 900 pounds that had to be ordered and flown in. So that arrived within 24 hours. And then the crowds were just insane. They were absolutely massive. Um, and there was a ton of security and police officers. Those people all had to be, you know, assigned and whatnot. There was a tour, so Elvis was supposed to go out on tour the very next day after the funeral, and it was a big, elaborate U.S. cross country tour that had to be canceled. And then there was just all the, random things that have to be done to plan for a funeral between clothing being ordered and songs, deciding on what songs to play, contacting ministers, and just a whole bunch of really, the minor details that had to be taken care of. And again, this all happened basically in less than a day. But probably the biggest controversy of the funeral has to do with Elvis's body. So this is the only photograph that was taken at the funeral. Cameras were strictly prohibited in the funeral, at the funeral, and someone had snuck in a camera and took this photograph of Elvis in his coffin. And this is the only photograph from the funeral. And there were all these reports of people saying that this wasn't Elvis in the coffin at all, because this photograph wasn't supposed to exist. There wasn't supposed to be any sort of photographic evidence of what he looked like in the coffin. And there were all these reports from people saying that it was a wax dummy in the coffin and it wasn't actually Elvis, his body. It wasn't actually Elvis. And they were saying all these details with the body were just wrong. The nose apparently just did not look like his nose. The eyebrows were wrong. The shape of his chin, just all these things with the body were just totally inaccurate. And there were all these reports from people who saw it who said, no, this was a wax dummy. This was not Elvis in the coffin. This lady LaCosta was a country singer. She said he looked just like a piece of plastic lying there. It didn't look like him at all. He looked more like a dummy than a real person. Another songwriter who worked with Elvis said, it wasn't Elvis, I can tell you that much. It looked like a wax dummy. And another strange thing about the coffin is that it was a 900-pound coffin. And that is a insanely heavy coffin, like abnormally heavy. And there was all this weight that was basically unaccounted for with the coffin. And it was speculated by some that it had an air conditioning unit built into it because it really was a wax dummy. And Memphis in August, the wax would have melted, and so there was a air conditioning unit built into the coffin, and that's why it was such a ridiculously heavy coffin. Another interesting thing that happened was, there were all these fan clubs of Elvis that existed at the time, and these fans were like rabidly just obsessed with Elvis. They knew everything about him. They had a million photos of him. And Vernon Presley, who was Elvis's dad, personally called some of the bigger Elvis newsletter fan groups, like the people who headed him up, the presidents. He called them personally and asked them not to attend the funeral. Um, and initially, and most of them obeyed it. And then down the road, they figured out, or they speculated, that the reason he had called them personally and told them not to attend was they would have noticed, and they would have been able to spot right away that that just was not Elvis in the casket, in the coffin. And so that's why Vernon Presley called them at all and specifically told them, or asked them, not to come to the funeral. And then they obviously all had these, massive newsletters with just humongous, readerships and memberships. And so if, they had noticed that that just wasn't Elvis in the coffin, they could have got the word out, and, the whole thing could have just spiraled out of control. And another really interesting thing with Elvis's death is the name on the gravestone. So you can see there it's spelled Elvis Aaron Presley, Aaron with two A's. And Elvis went by Aaron Presley with one A. It was Aaron, Aoron. And it's that way on his marriage certificate, his signatures, his high school diploma, even his birth certificate has the one A. And so the fact that his name is misspelled on the gravestone is really strange. Why would this happen? Well, Elvis was really big into like spiritualism and the esoteric, and it was thought he didn't want to tempt fate. If he had indeed faked this and his body wasn't, buried here, he didn't want to have his actual name on the gravestone because he'd be tempting fate, having bad karma and whatnot. And so they purposely misspelled his name on the gravestone just to not kind of tempt fate and maybe have bad karma. And another curious thing is that all photos from the scene of his death are missing. So he supposedly collapsed in the bathroom and he died in the bathroom at Graceland. All those photos are missing. And then another curious thing is that there was an inventory done of Graceland after he had died, and it listed everything that was in Graceland at the time. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that was just missing from this inventory, just a whole bunch of things. The president of the biggest Elvis fan club, she basically knew everything there was to know about Elvis, knew all about, the things he bought and what he owned. And she talked about just she was able to study, or she was given a copy of the inventory list that was taken after Elvis died. And she talked about the things that she saw on the inventory and just how strange the whole thing was and how much was missing from it in an interview. We'll play that video here real quick.
That was the week that we saw a copy of the inventory of Elvis's estate. It was 84 pages long, but it was 84 pages too short. There were a lot of things that were missing that should have been there. This was an inventory of everything that was in Graceland at the time. And there were no photographs of his mother listed, no photographs of his daughter. His diaries were missing. Most of his jewelry was gone. He had maybe 5 pieces of jewelry listed, and everybody knows Elvis loved jewelry, and he had a tremendous amount of rings and watches and necklaces, pendants. None of those were there. Some of his cars were missing. A plane was missing. It was unbelievable.
And another curious thing that happened was this name John Burroughs is the name that Elvis commonly gave. It was kind of like his code name. He had even given the name to President Richard Nixon because Elvis did some work with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which is kind of like the precursor to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And he used the code name John Burroughs during his work with the DEA. We'll get into that in a little bit because that's another very strange aspect to this, his work as an undercover agent for the government. But he did use this John Burroughs name all the time. And it's even been said that sometimes if, someone is working with the government and they're given an alias, they're also provided things like a passport or a birth certificate in that name. So Elvis used the name John Burroughs a lot. And in the book by Gail Brewer Giorgio, she talks to someone who worked at the Memphis airport who claimed that on August 17th, which was the day after Elvis died, a man who kind of looked like Elvis picked up a ticket that had been reserved under the name John Burroughs, and this person didn't really think of anything about it at the time. And then they read later on that John Burroughs was the name that Elvis commonly used, and so they reached out to this Gail Brewer Giorgio and told her about this person who was picking up this ticket under the name John Burroughs from the Memphis airport on the day after Elvis died. And another one of the really strange, bizarre aspects to Elvis's both his life and his death is his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. This guy is a really mysterious guy. So first off, his name is not Tom Parker. He was actually born in the Netherlands, and his name is Andreas Cornelius van Kuhik. And he illegally immigrated to the United States when he was 20 years old and adopted the name Tom Parker. So we always told the story that his name was Tom Parker and he was born in West Virginia in like the coal country, but that was all made up. He was actually Andreas Cornelius von Kujic. He was born in the Netherlands. So that's one strange thing about him. It's always been speculated that the reason Elvis never toured internationally was because this Colonel Tom Parker, he couldn't get like a passport or a driver's license or anything because he was here illegally. And so that's why Elvis never toured, outside of the United States. 'Cause it obviously would have made just a ton of money, going on a worldwide tour. And it's interesting because, some people claim that what Elvis did was he just disappeared and adopted a new identity. And this Colonel Tom Parker had done literally the exact same thing. He had experience doing this exact same thing. He adopted the identity and everything, Colonel Tom Parker, even though he wasn't born here and that wasn't his real name. And so some people claim, well, that's exactly what, Elvis did if he, did fake his death. Another interesting thing about Tom Parker is that the day after Elvis died, instead of returning to Memphis and being there for, planning the funeral and being there to mourn Elvis and support his family and whatnot, instead, Tom Parker flew out east and he met with this guy, Harry Giesler, who ran one of the biggest merchandising firms in the United States. And he cut a deal to like come out with all this memorabilia and all this stuff regarding or surrounding Elvis's death. And so instead, it just has always seemed kind of weird because if you're the manager of Elvis and he all of a sudden, suddenly dies at age 42, totally unexpected, you would imagine the very first thing you would do is fly immediately back to Memphis to be there for the funeral and be there for planning the funeral and everything like that. But Colonel Tom Parker flew out east to meet with this merchandising expert and cut a really substantial deal to, capitalize on Elvis's death and make just a ton of money. And then he also has this really interesting quote that he gave just right after Elvis died. Colonel Tom Parker said, "Elvis didn't die, the body did. We're keeping up the good spirits. We're keeping Elvis alive. I talked to him this morning and he told me to carry on." A little bit of an interesting quote there. And then there's all these really strange, mysterious things surrounding the Colonel. He made an absolute fortune off of Elvis. He made more than Elvis did off of Elvis. We mentioned he didn't have a passport or driver's license, and that's why Elvis never toured out of the US. And he was also really big into hypnotism. There were all these stories about how proficient he was as a hypnotist. He could make he could mass hypnotize people, make people get down on their floors and bark like dogs. And so this whole Colonel Parker thing is just a really interesting little side note, and it's definitely interesting how he was very adept and very experienced at creating an entirely new identity and going off to live under that identity, which is what some people claim Elvis did after he died. And another insanely weird chapter to this Elvis death, the mystery surrounding Elvis's death, is this guy Orion. So right after about a year or two after Elvis died, this singer named Orion appeared, and he sounds exactly like Elvis. He always wore this mask over his face, and as he kinda got popular and started appearing, in places, people really started questioning, like, "Is this actually Elvis in disguise?" Because Orion sounds exactly, I'm talking exactly like Elvis. I won't actually play him singing just to avoid a copyright strike on this video, but you can find a ton of videos on YouTube of Orion singing and giving interviews, and I mean, his voice is identical to Elvis. There's a whole bunch of really interesting, strange things dealing with Orion that kind of like have connections to Elvis. He recorded with Sun Records, which was Elvis's very first label that he recorded with, and just so happens that Orion also recorded with Sun Records. And there was a lot of real mystery surrounding him and like who he was and what his background was and where he came from. He claimed he was born in Ribbonsville, Tennessee, which isn't actually a city. It's not a town. It doesn't exist at all. It's a totally fake place. Um, and then there were also like these kind of subtle clues and subtle hints that he would give in his song titles and the names of his albums that just kind of like alluded to Elvis. He came out with one um record at the time where he just sang Elvis songs, sounds absolutely identical to him, titled another one Reborn. There were all these, there were a couple other names of records that dealt with like reincarnation and born again, things like that. This photo here was just included on one of the backs of his albums, two separate people. I don't think this is the same person. They both have different necklaces on and kind of have different facial features, but there's these two people with the Orion mask on just sitting in a red hot tub. And then there was all this speculation about who this Orion guy was and was this really Elvis? And one of the things that did emerge with people wondered if this was actually Elvis's brother, because it eventually came out that this man, his name was Jimmy Ellis, was actually Orion. He fessed up to the whole thing. That's him on the right there. On the left there is Vernon Presley, who was Elvis's dad. So you can see they look almost identical. And it has been claimed by people that Jimmy Ellis was actually Elvis's brother, and that's why they sounded so similar. This whole Orion thing is just very, very weird. I mean, it's just incredibly strange. They really do sound absolutely identical. The fact that he just always wears this weird mask, or he always wore this weird mask when he performed, is a very strange thing. There was all this speculation about, was this Elvis? Because again, he really does just sound exactly like him. One of the more interesting theories was talked about in this book, Is Elvis Alive? This is the Gail Brewer Giorgio book. And she had talked to a president of one of Elvis's fan clubs, and this person was telling her about seeing Orion in concert. And so this person said, I was watching Orion, and then he went back behind the curtain for a quick drink of water. I saw sweat marks under Orion's arm. So he'd been performing for a while. He's really sweaty. And then when he returned, I suddenly felt a jolt. It wasn't the same man. There were no sweat marks, and he was only out of sight for a few seconds. And this person said, I would swear on a stack of Bibles that this was not the same Orion who went back behind the curtain for water. Um, so again, the speculation was kind of that Elvis could have known this Jimmy Ellis, maybe it even was his brother, and he knew that they sounded exactly alike. And so Elvis just didn't want to completely give up performing and completely give up from music. So he had Jimmy Ellis slash Orion wear this mask, and then Elvis had like a designer make two of everything. So identical jumpsuits, identical masks, and then they almost like alternated. Sometimes Jimmy Ellis would sing, sometimes Elvis would sing. And if anyone suspected anything, they just bring out Jimmy Ellis and say, no, 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 there's nothing weird going on here. It's just Jimmy Ellis. But it is very interesting how this president of the fan club said, the Orion that they saw on stage was just totally covered in sweat, just, out of breath and everything. Then said he was going back to get a quick drink of water and he disappeared off stage. And the person who came back on stage was wearing the exact same outfit and everything, but wasn't sweaty at all. And, it was speculated that Elvis could have pulled off something like this to, perform in front of people and have that happen. Another interesting thing has to do with this Dr. George Nikopoulos. Dr. Nick is what he was referred to as. He was Elvis's personal doctor, and they were very, very close. And at the time of Elvis's death, he was in pretty bad financial shape. He had borrowed $200,000 from Elvis 2 years earlier, and then another $55,000. So it was about $250,000 he had borrowed. They were very close, and he had invested in a real estate deal that had gone pretty sour. And so it was said that at the time of Elvis's death, this Dr. Nick was in really bad financial shape. This Dr. Nick's name does appear on the medical examiner's report. And so it has been speculated that, well, if he, loved Elvis like a son, basically, and was also in really bad financial shape, he could have been convinced to help Elvis escape to freedom. And another really just absolutely bizarre aspect to Elvis's life was his work as a federal agent. So this is a photo on the left there of when he met with President Richard Nixon and talked about what he could do to help solve the drug epidemic in the United States. There's official government documentation about their meeting and what they talked about. He was issued this badge from the Bureau of Narcotics that given this badge. He really took his work as an undercover agent and his work combating drugs. He took it really seriously. He was named a captain by the Memphis Police Department, and he was also named a captain by the state of Colorado Organized Crime Strike Force. So it wasn't just like a figurehead or like a thing he talked about. He really took it seriously. He also provided an undercover agent who was a musician. He provided him a job cover touring with his band, touring with Elvis. So again, this is a official government document that talks about it. It says during the period of 1974 through 1976, Mr. Presley provided one of our undercover agents who was a musician a job cover. And having this job cover made it possible for our agent to develop a number of quality investigations. So again, the fact that he was, letting this undercover agent tour with him and develop all these leads and investigate all this stuff, Elvis definitely took the whole thing seriously. It wasn't just kind of like a joke thing or anything like that. Again, the name John Burroughs, which we mentioned earlier, that comes up a lot. He gave that name not only to the people he worked with in the Bureau of Narcotics, but he also gave it to President Richard Nixon, telling them that they should use that John Burroughs nickname, anytime they needed to call him and get a hold of him urgently, because his phone calls, he claimed, were really screened and it was, obviously very tough to get a hold of him. So he used that name, John Burroughs, anytime they had them use that anytime they needed to get a hold of him. Again, a lot of times, apparently at least, if people are working undercover or working under assumed names with the government as special agents, they're given a new driver's license or even passport with that name on it. And again, Elvis's code name was John Burroughs. So if he had wanted to, disappear or whatnot, and he already had a identification or passport with that name John Burroughs, it would have made it much easier to disappear. He was also constantly spotted and constantly wearing this DEA staff warm up in the final years of his life. And then this Gail Brewer Giorgio, who really spent a lot of time investigating Elvis's work as a special agent for the government. She gave a really good interview about kind of everything she found. I'll play a clip here real quick from her interview about Elvis's time as an undercover agent for the government.
He was a federal agent. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I have read 663 FBI files on Elvis Presley, and his life was in danger. It's clear by the FBI reports. There were serious assassination threats made against him.
Recently, Gail Giorgio and myself viewed FBI documents obtained by Gail. In these documents, Elvis was the subject of numerous death threats. Some of these threats came from well-known underground figures.
And so it's always been speculated that one of the reasons he wanted to disappear was that his life was in danger because of these undercover investigations and this work that he did looking into, drug rings and the mafia and whatnot. And it has been speculated that he disappeared due to death threats made on his life. Here he is, meeting, I think this is the Denver Police Department. And, obviously he's not just like a bystander, just, showing up and taking a few pictures. I mean, he's taking detailed notes in a little notebook there and talking with the investigators. So it is really interesting how, he definitely took this work as an undercover agent and took this work, combating the drug issue. He took it very seriously, apparently. And now we'll just get into some speculation and rumors and just the sort of things that have happened since his death, quote unquote, in 1977. The first is that there were a number of rumors that Elvis was living in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And Gail Brewer Giorgio kind of mentioned this and talked about this a bit in her book. And after she had mentioned it, it really kind of took on a life of its own. And there were a whole bunch of news stories and rumors and things of that nature about Elvis living in Kalamazoo. And a lot of this, and actually, Elvis did uh, tour and have tour stops in Kalamazoo for a number of his tours, which always kind of seemed like a bit of a strange, place to stop. It's not necessarily, it's not a major city at all, actually. And a bunch of his tours actually stopped in Kalamazoo. So that was part of it. But a lot of this rumor stemmed from this picture here. So that's Muhammad Ali on the right, and that's Jesse Jackson on the left there. And then there's that man in the background there who actually does kind of look like Elvis. And so Gail Brewer Giorgio talked about kind of how she became aware of this picture and why she investigated it a little more and what she found. She talked about that in the interview. I'll play her clip real quick here where she talks about this picture.
But what happened was that I had received a telephone call some years ago from a woman who was a nurse at a hospital in New York City. And she said that Muhammad Ali had been a patient there. And while at the hospital, she said a man who looked identical to Elvis Presley visited Ali. Now, most people do realize that Muhammad Ali and Elvis were very, very close friends. They saw each other. He would visit Ali at his training camps and so forth. But there wasn't too much I could do about the information because it wasn't verifiable. Then, I guess, a couple of years ago, I received a telephone call and a letter from a woman from Ohio, and she had a copy of the Cincinnati Post, and she said that when Ali was leaving the hospital, it was a UPI story, leaving the hospital, he left with other men. It was on a Thursday night that they had left. And one of the men was Jesse Jackson. There was another unidentified man with Ali, and a fourth man who was captured. And it looks identical to Elvis Presley.
And what's also interesting is Muhammad Ali had very strong ties to Michigan. He lived in Michigan in a place called Berrien Hills, which is very close to Kalamazoo. So there was kind of that connection as well. And then in this Is Elvis Alive book, there was also an interview that Gail Brewer Giorgio did with a lady who lived in Michigan who talked about, and this was kind of like how the rumor that Elvis was living in Kalamazoo originated. And so this lady was in Michigan, and she told Gail that Elvis, he may have purchased a hotel excuse me, he may have purchased a hotel here. The hotel sat empty for many years and then was turned into offices, but there's a private residence on the upper level. And she was pretty sure he went by the name John Burroughs now. Elvis went by the name John Burroughs. Again, there's that John Burroughs name that we talked about who bought a ticket or who picked up a ticket at the Memphis airport the day after Elvis died. And also, that was Elvis's code name with the government. There were a number of people who reported like sightings of Elvis and seeing him at various places around Kalamazoo. This lady actually gave Gail Brewer Giorgio a phone number for a man named Jay Burroughs, and she tried the number and left a message for him, but never got a call back. And it was indeed a hotel complex, which is what this lady claimed Elvis was now doing in Kalamazoo. She owned this hotel complex. So that's one of the, kind of interesting rumors and speculation that's emerged in the years since. There's also this guy, Bob Joyce. You can find a lot about him on the internet in various places. He's a pastor in Arkansas who has an absolutely killer voice. His voice is incredible. He's a very, very talented musician. A lot of people claim he's Elvis, and there's a whole bunch of videos out there, a whole bunch of TikTok videos as well. So you can find plenty of videos that kind of speculate on this guy being Elvis. It's pretty interesting to look into. There were also a number of like kind of really interesting like mystery recordings and mystery albums that came out. We talked about Orion earlier, but there was also this Jerry Lee Lewis album. It was called The Killer and the King, and it was released in 1982. And you can see in the upper left there, it was Jerry Lee Lewis and a surprise guest. And obviously, Elvis's nickname was the King. And then, so that kind of led to speculation that this might be Elvis on the album, because the person singing with Jerry Lee Lewis sounds identical, absolutely identical to Elvis, absolutely identical. And then there was also this note on the inside of the album. It's from this guy Don Tweedy who worked with Elvis. And he says, also on this album, there is another voice which is not positively identified. However, my guess is that that it is the voice of another rock and roll great for whom I did some arranging in the late 60s and early 70s and was the quote unquote idol of rock and roll for fans all over the world. And so that's pretty interesting. And again, this Don Tweedy guy did work with Elvis. And what another very interesting thing about this album is that again, it's named The Killer, the King, and it's with a surprise guest who sounds exactly like Elvis. And so people really, when this was released in 1982, they really speculated like, was this Elvis? Because Elvis was very good friends with Jerry Lee Lewis as well when he was living, and they were both popular. And so after there was all this speculation, they claimed, at least, or they came out with saying that no, it wasn't Elvis on the album. It was actually Orion. So, apparently this surprise guest who's billed on the cover of this The Killer the King album, they claim it's Orion. It sounds exactly like Elvis. But that's definitely interesting that it just kind of came out that, oh, by the way, this is actually Orion on this album. There was also another Jerry Lee Lewis album. Um, this was billed as Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Rich, Carl Perkins, and Friends. And if you look at the track list there, it's always Jerry Lee Lewis and a friend. Charlie Rich and a friend, Carl Perkins and a friend. This friend is never identified. Again, this sounds exactly like Elvis, and there's like these interesting little clues or hints that are dropped kind of like throughout the album. There's this silhouette of a man on the cover. It looks exactly like the silhouette of Elvis. There's also this kind of like shadowy figure in the background of another cover. Kind of looks like Elvis with the sideburns. So it's definitely interesting. And there's also this site, it's www.lindahoodsigmundstruth.com. She claims this is a picture of Elvis right here on the right, and he goes by the name Jesse now. Elvis did have a twin brother named Jesse who died before being birthed. And so what this Linda Hood Sigmund lady claims is that Elvis took the identity of his brother Jesse, and I think he now lives in like Arkansas or Missouri. Again, she claims this is Elvis in the picture there, and her site is a little disorganized, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff on there. She's done a lot of research. She has a number of like jewelry items and notes that she claims this Jesse has written to her and given to her. She claims she's just been in constant communication with him. Interestingly, this doctor here, Dr. Donald Hinton, in the early 2000s, he claimed that he was treating Elvis Presley. It was one of his clients. And he also claimed that Elvis was going by the name Jesse now. And this was kind of actually a big deal in the early 2000s. There were a number of news reports on the Fox 8 station in Cleveland about this doctor and his claims that he was treating Elvis Presley. This video here, it's a pretty good video. It's almost an hour long of just news reports about this Dr. Donald Hinton's claims that he was treating Elvis Presley, and they really dove into it and really investigated it. It's pretty interesting to look into. So just to kind of wrap things up here, obviously there's just a million strange things going on with this whole Elvis death, between the absurdity and the strangeness going on with his funeral, his name being misspelled on the gravestone, the wax body that many people claimed was in the casket and not Elvis's actual body. There's the whole Orion thing, which is just bizarre. And then, of course, there's his drug connection, working as a special agent for the government. Some people claimed he was in serious trouble because of that, and that's why he had to fake his death and disappear. And then, of course, there's the really bizarre mystery of Colonel Tom Parker, his prowess as a hypnotist, and his background, creating a brand new identity for himself. So this whole story is just bizarre. Hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you soon.